The year was 1910, and in the bustling city of Skopje, then part of the Ottoman Empire, today the capital of North Macedonia, a baby girl was born into a modest but devout Albanian Catholic family. Her parents named her Angies Gonksbojaksiu. Few could have imagined that this fragile child, the youngest of three, would one day capture the world's imagination, be called a saint by millions, and become the face of both compassion and controversy. Yet her journey began in shadows, amidst political turmoil, religious devotion, and the aching struggles of a land caught between empires. Her father, Nikol, was a successful merchant, deeply engaged in civic life and promotion of Albanian identity at a time when nationalism stirred against Ottoman decline. He was respected in the community, a man of strong convictions, but his sudden death when Angies was only 8 years old changed everything. Rumors whispered of poisoning, perhaps political retribution, though no proof ever surfaced. His absence left the family shattered, with her mother, Drana, carrying the burden of raising the children. It was within this crucible of grief and resilience that Angies absorbed the lessons that would shape her destiny. Her mother's unshakable faith, her tenderness of the poor, and her insistence that the family never turn away a beggar at their door. The streets of Skopje offered constant reminders of suffering. War, shifting borders, and the decline of the Ottoman Empire gave rise to poverty and unrest. For a sensitive child, the sight of beggars, widows, and orphans etched themselves into her memory. She grew up listening to stories of missionaries in far-off lands, their courage and sacrifice stirring something restless in her young soul. By the age of 12, she felt the first whispers of a calling, to serve God completely, to give her life to something greater than herself. The church became her refuge. Under the guidance of Jesuit priests, she absorbed not only scripture, but also the missionary zeal that stretched from Europe to India and beyond. At 18, she made a choice that would sever her from her home forever. She left Skopje, with nothing but determination in her faith, to join the Sisters of Loreto in Ireland. She had never traveled so far, and the moment was filled with a mixture of dread and conviction. Ireland was cold, foreign, and its language unfamiliar to her ears. But it was there that she received her name and religion. Sister Mary Teresa, after St. Teresa of Lisieux, the little flower of Jesus. The next chapter carried her further still, to the heat and chaos of colonial India. By 1929, she had arrived in Calcutta, a city that would define her life. At that time, Calcutta was a paradox of grandeur and misery. It was a jewel of the British Raj, with imposing buildings and institutions, yet its streets overflowed with poverty, disease, and despair. The contrast was stark, the suffering immense. For a young nun, barely 20, the reality was overwhelming. She began her work as a teacher at St. Mary's High School for Girls in Entally, a school run by the Loreto sisters. There, she taught geography and catechism, her voice soft but commanding, her demeanor calm but disciplined. But something unsettled her. Beyond the walls of the school, beyond the classrooms filled with middle-class girls, lay a world of hunger and hopelessness. The cries of the poor outside the convent's gates began to drown out the voices inside. Though she loved teaching, she felt an ache, a persistent pull toward those who had no one. She had promised God her whole life. But was this enough? The 1940s brought upheaval that would force her to confront the depth of that question. In 1943, Bengal suffered a devastating famine. Millions perished, their emaciated bodies collapsing in the streets. Victims not only of failed harvests, but also of wartime policies that exacerbated starvation. Teresa witnessed the spectacle of mothers cradling dead infants, of men too weak to rise from the gutters. And then, in 1946, as India's struggle for independence reached fever pitch, Calcutta erupted into communal violence. Hindu and Muslim clashes claimed thousands of lives in just a few days. Blood ran in alleys. It was in this chaos that she experienced what she later described as a call within a call. On September 10th, 1946, traveling by train to Darjeeling for a retreat, she felt the unmistakable voice of God speaking to her heart. He was calling her, she believed, to leave the convent and to live among the poorest of the poor, to serve them not from afar, but as one of them. This was no ordinary inspiration. It was a command so fierce, so insistent, that she could not ignore it. Yet the path forward was fraught with uncertainty. To leave the Loreto sisters was not a simple matter. She had taken vows of obedience. She belonged to them. Permission had to be granted, and the process was long and grueling. For nearly 2 years, she wrestled with church authorities, pleading her case, writing letters that described the urgency of her mission. At last, in 1948, she was granted approval. Clothed in a simple white sari with a blue border, the attire of poor Bengali women, she stepped into the streets of Calcutta alone, carrying only her faith and a burning resolve. The streets embraced her not with welcome, but with indifference and hostility. She began her work by attending to the sick and the dying, gathering children from the slums to teach them under the open sky. With no money, she scrounged for supplies, using sticks to trace letters in the dirt. People mocked her, doubted her, called her mad. But slowly, her persistence broke through resistance. Some of her former students, now young women, joined her. Others, inspired by her example, offered help. The seeds of what would become the missionaries of charity were sown. Her mission was simple in principle yet radical in execution: to give wholehearted, free service to the poorest of the poor. In a world divided by caste, creed, and class, she crossed boundaries fearlessly. She bathed wounds infested with maggots, lifted men from gutters, and carried the dying to places of dignity. Her face, lined with sweat and dust, became a beacon of something both ancient and revolutionary: compassion stripped of all pretense. But as the first decade of her independent mission unfolded, whispers grew louder. Admirers saw her as a living saint. Critics questioned her methods, her faith, her motives. Was she truly alleviating suffering, or merely making the poor accept it? Was her work service or submission? And as her name began to spread beyond Calcutta, as the world turned its eyes toward this diminutive woman in a white sari, one question hung heavily in the air: how could one woman bear the weight of such impossible expectations? The answer would come, but not without struggle and not without shadows. For even as her public image began to rise, inside her heart a storm of silence was beginning to grow, an emptiness that no one could see, an absence that would haunt her for decades. The years following her first steps into Calcutta's slums brought both triumph and trial. In 1950, after years of tireless labor and countless appeals, the Vatican officially recognized her new order, the Missionaries of Charity. It began humbly, with only a handful of sisters, all dressed in the plain cotton sari with a blue border, their vows dedicated not only to chastity, poverty, and obedience, but also to a fourth vow, to give wholehearted free service to the poorest of the poor. What started as a fragile dream now had the sanction of the church and the beginnings of permanence. Calcutta, in those days, was teeming with the aftermath of independence and partition. Millions of refugees poured into the city after the violent division of India and Pakistan in 1947. The already strained resources were overwhelmed, and the streets were filled with men, women, and children abandoned to hunger and disease. Cholera, leprosy, and tuberculosis spread unchecked, and bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. Into this crucible of despair walked Mother Teresa and her sisters, carrying no weapons but love and determination. Their first permanent home was nothing more than a dilapidated building provided by the city, but within those crumbling walls they established Nirmal Hriday, the place of the pure heart. It was a home for the dying. Here, the destitute who had been discarded in the gutters were carried in, washed, fed, and given dignity in their final hours. Some recovered and left. Many died. Yet each life, however brief, was embraced as sacred. The sisters whispered prayers, bathed wounds, and held hands as breath faded. To the world, it seemed unthinkable. Why choose to live among decay? Why cradle the dying? But to her, every face reflected the image of Christ. As the Missionaries of Charity expanded, opening homes for abandoned children and the leprosy-stricken, her reputation began to spread far beyond India. Journalists wrote of the saint of the gutters, and visitors who came to witness her work left astonished. By the 1960s, branches of her order appeared outside Calcutta, then across India, and eventually throughout the world. She had tapped into something deeply human, a hunger for compassion, in an era fractured by Cold War tensions, social upheaval, and global inequality. But behind her public face of tireless service, there was a hidden struggle, a torment she revealed only in private letters decades later. From the late 1940s onward, she experienced what she described as a profound dark night of the soul. The presence of God, once so vivid to her, now seemed distant, silent, absent. For nearly 50 years, she labored under this inner desolation, confessing confessors that she felt nothing but emptiness, loneliness, even doubt. Outwardly, she radiated serenity. Inwardly, she carried a cross of silence. She wrote, "The place of God in my soul is blank. There's no God in me." Yet she never ceased her work, believing her suffering allowed her to share more deeply in the passion of Christ. Her strength lay not in ease of faith, but in persistence through its absence. Still, this duality raises questions even today. Was her sanctity greater because she persevered despite doubt, or was it undermined by the very silence she confessed? Her story is not one of simplicity, but of paradox. By the 1970s, she had become a global figure. In 1979, she received the Nobel Peace Prize, an honor that placed her alongside world leaders and revolutionaries. Standing before dignitaries in Oslo, she spoke not of politics, but of love, of seeing Christ in the unwanted, unloved, and uncared for. She refused the banquet prepared in her honor, asking instead that the funds be given to the poor. The image of this small, wrinkled woman confronting the grandeur of power struck the world with awe. She had become a moral voice in an age desperate for authenticity. And yet, admiration was not universal. Even during her lifetime, critics began to probe deeper. Some questioned the medical standards of her homes, accusing her of providing inadequate care, of focusing more on spiritual comfort than on modern medicine. Others accused her of accepting donations from dubious sources, including political leaders and businessmen with questionable reputations. The most scathing critiques came later, branding her as someone who glorified suffering rather than alleviating it. She became both a symbol of selfless charity and a lightning rod for debate about the nature of aid, faith, and dignity. The world saw her as tireless, but her body began to break under the weight of ceaseless labor. In the 1980s and 1990s, heart problems plagued her, and she often required hospitalization. Still, she refused to slow down. At times, she traveled to war zones, appearing in Lebanon during bombardments to rescue children trapped in hospitals, her presence somehow commanding ceasefires, if only briefly. Her life became a blend of myth and reality, her courage celebrated, her flaws scrutinized. But as the 1990s closed in, the world began to sense that the end of her earthly journey was near. In 1997, weakened and frail, she resigned as head of the Missionaries of Charity, passing the torch to her successors. By September that year, she was gone, her death mourned across continents. The woman who had begun life as NG's Gongsbojaksiu in a small Balkan town had left behind a global order with thousands of sisters, brothers, priests, and lay workers in over 100 countries. Yet even in death, her story was unfinished. To some, she was already a saint. To others, she was a symbol to be questioned, even dismantled. The Catholic Church would move swiftly toward canonization, while skeptics would raise louder objections. Who was the real Mother Teresa, a beacon of compassion, or a complex figure entangled in contradictions? And as her body lay in state, visited by presidents and paupers alike, one question lingered in the air with haunting force. Would her legacy heal the division she left behind? Or would the arguments over her methods and motives only grow stronger in the years to come? The world did not wait long to begin shaping her memory. Within 2 years of her death, the Vatican initiated the process of canonization, an extraordinary speed by church standards. In 2003, before a crowd of hundreds of thousands in St. Peter's Square, Pope John Paul II beatified her, declaring her Blessed Teresa of Calcutta. The path to sainthood, however, demanded more than admiration. It required miracles, verified by rigorous investigation. Reports surfaced of healings attributed to her intercession, stories of cancers vanishing, of tumors dissolving. For believers, these were signs of divine favor. For skeptics, they were coincidences dressed in the language of faith. Meanwhile, her order continued to expand. The Missionaries of Charity grew to thousands of members, serving in the slums of Latin America, the deserts of Africa, the war zones of the Balkans, and the inner cities of the West. Dressed in their blue-bordered saris, they became instantly recognizable, embodiments of her vision to care for the hungry, the naked, the homeless, the crippled, the blind, the lepers, all those who feel unwanted, unloved, uncared for throughout society. The work did not cease with her passing. If anything, it multiplied. But even as her image was enshrined in stained glass and statues, a counter-narrative pressed forward. Writers and activists accused her of perpetuating suffering rather than relieving it, arguing that her homes lacked proper pain relief, that she opposed modern medical interventions, that she emphasized spiritual surrender over physical healing. Her outspoken opposition to abortion and contraception drew further criticism, particularly from secular circles that viewed her as a champion of suffering rather than liberation. Documentaries and books challenged her saintly reputation, portraying her as a figure of contradiction, revered and reviled, exalted and examined under merciless light. The debate over her legacy was not just about one woman. It became a mirror reflecting larger questions. What does it mean to serve the poor? Is compassion enough without structural change? Can holiness exist alongside imperfection? To her defenders, she was proof that love need not be perfect to be transformative. To her critics, she symbolized the dangers of unquestioned piety, a cautionary tale of how good intentions could collide with flawed execution. Yet, the story was not finished. In 2016, under Pope Francis, she was canonized a saint in a ceremony attended by pilgrims from around the globe. He described her as a dispenser of divine mercy, a woman who had made herself available to the least of society. The title Saint Teresa Calcutta became official, cementing her in the Church's calendar and in the devotion of millions. For those who had walked with her, her sainthood was not in question. It had been visible all along in the dust of Calcutta's streets, in the eyes of the dying cradled in her arms. Still, even sainthood did not silence her contradictions. The letters she had once begged to be destroyed, but which instead were preserved, revealed her decades of inner emptiness. They painted a picture of a woman who, while publicly exuding certainty, privately endured almost relentless doubt. For some, this made her more relatable, proof of the cost of discipleship. For others, it suggested a hidden chasm between appearance and reality. Meanwhile, the sisters she had left behind carried on her work with fierce simplicity. In the slums of Kolkata, the sick continued to be lifted from sidewalks, the abandoned infants taken into their homes, the dying granted dignity. To walk through the doors of Nirmal Hriday today is to see her vision still alive, a small army of women quietly laboring, uncelebrated, uncompromising, tending to those the world discards. Her mission had outlived her, yet the shadow of her critics lingered. Scholars debated whether her opposition to systemic reform had left the structures of poverty untouched. Human rights activists questioned the flow of donations and the transparency of her order. At the same time, countless individuals testified that their lives had been changed by her touch, her presence, or the movement she had inspired. Her story became less about choosing sides and more about embracing paradox. She was both light and shadow, strength and frailty, saint and struggler. In her own words, she had once confessed, "I am only a pencil in God's hand. He does the writing. The pencil has nothing to do with it." Was it humility, or was it the burden of self-effacement demanded by her role? As the new millennium unfolded, her face continued to appear in schools, hospitals, and chapels. Her name became shorthand for service, invoked by politicians, charities, and activists alike. Even those who doubted her methods rarely doubted her sincerity. And yet, the tension remained unresolved. Was she a towering icon of love, or a deeply flawed woman elevated beyond measure? The question echoes still, unresolved, pushing us toward the heart of her story. Because the truth of her life is not found in marble statues or blistering critiques. It lies in the enduring impact of her choices, and in the haunting silence of her own unanswered prayers. But history is not content with reverence or criticism alone. It presses forward, demanding to know, in the end, did her way of service transform the world, or did it simply hold a candle in the darkness without ever dispelling it? The answer awaits in the legacy she left behind, a legacy both luminous and contested, and in the fragile question that lingers even now: what does it mean to love when love itself feels absent? Her death in 1997 had seemed to close a chapter, Yet in truth it opened another, one that stretched across continents and decades. Her funeral in Kolkata drew world leaders and masses of ordinary people alike. The Indian government accorded her the rare honor of a state funeral, her coffin borne on a gun carriage usually reserved for heads of state. Crowds filled the streets, weeping and reaching out to touch her casket, as a proximity to her body might pass along some fragment of her holiness. In that moment, she belonged not only to the church but to humanity itself. The years that followed became a struggle between memory and meaning. For some, she was the embodiment of the gospel lived out in flesh and blood, the clearest example of Christ's love in the 20th century. For others, she was a complex, even troubling figure, whose work exposed the tension between charity and justice. Yet the sheer scale of her influence could not be denied. The missionaries of charity continued to grow, serving in prisons, hospices, schools, and disaster zones across the globe. What had begun with one woman and a handful of saris had become a movement that spanned more than 130 countries. Her canonization in 2016 marked the Church's final word on her sanctity, but it did not erase the shadows. The revelation of her long interior darkness, the decades of feeling abandoned by God, haunted even her admirers. How could someone so revered for holiness confess to such emptiness? Yet perhaps this was her final, paradoxical gift, to show that sanctity was not the absence of struggle but a courage to endure it. Her letters revealed a woman who felt unseen by God, yet who never ceased to see God in the suffering of others. To many, this made her holiness all the more real, born not of ecstasy but of perseverance. At the same time, her critics pressed their case with renewed force. They argued that her homes for the dying lacked proper pain relief, that her insistence on spiritual comfort sometimes came at the cost of physical care, that she aligned herself with controversial leaders and accepted money from questionable sources. These critiques struck at the very heart of her reputation, challenging the image of pure, untainted love. To dismiss them entirely would be dishonest. To let them define her legacy would be incomplete. She remains, in history, a contested figure, saint to some, stumbling servant to others. And yet, beyond the debates, her image endures. Photographs of her small, stooped figure, her face lined with fatigue yet radiant with resolve, continue to inspire. Schools bear her name. Hospitals display her words. Not all of us can do great things, but we can do small things with great love. Her blue-bordered sari has become an icon as recognizable as any crown or throne. In cities across the world, volunteers continue to serve in her name, drawn by the vision she articulated so simply: to love until it hurts. The political, social, and religious conditions of her lifetime, colonial India, partition, famine, war, Cold War tensions, global inequality, gave rise to the crucible in which her mission was forged. She did not solve these crises. She did not end poverty or disease or violence. What she offered instead was presence, an insistence that no one, however broken, however forgotten, should die without dignity, without being seen, without being loved. Her strengths were immense: courage, endurance, a relentless will to serve. Her flaws were real: a resistance to modern medicine, a dependence on spiritual rhetoric that sometimes obscured practical needs, alliances that raised eyebrows. She was no plaster saint, immune from error. She was a human being, formidable and fragile, who carried the weight of her calling even when God seemed silent. In the end, her rise was not to power but to paradox. She became a symbol larger than herself, an emblem both of radical love and a contested charity. And her fall, if it can be called that, was not disgrace but doubt, the aching silence of a soul that longed for God and felt him absent. Her ultimate legacy is neither simple nor singular. It is a double-edged story, a life that inspired millions to acts of compassion, and a legacy that provoked hard questions about the nature of service and suffering. Perhaps this is why she continues to command attention, because she forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that love is not neat, that service is not perfect, that holiness may dwell alongside emptiness. More than a quarter century after her passing, the candle she lit in the slums of Kolkata still flickers. It has not banished the darkness of poverty, but it has offered light to countless souls lost within it. And that may be her final gift. Not the eradication of suffering, but the reminder that even in the deepest shadows, a single act of love can shine, however faintly, against despair. But as history continues to judge her, one question refuses to fade. Was Mother Teresa a saint who revealed the face of God in the poorest of the poor, or was she a flawed servant whose vision never rose beyond the limits of her faith? The answer lies not only in the record of her life, but in the choices we make in its wake. Whether we, too, will look upon forgotten and dare to see them as worthy of love. And so her story does not end with canonization, nor with criticism. It ends, instead, with a challenge, left hanging like a question in the silence she herself endured. What will we do when faced with the suffering of our world? Will we turn away, or will we, like her, step into the darkness, carrying nothing but love